Hello everyone. On this channel, I feel that information about what is happening in China is often not correctly conveyed to countries other than China, so I will be disseminating the information I have gathered in English. I'm getting information from multiple media, so I'd be happy if you could comment on the content of the video. Also, English is not my native language, so I use an AI speaker to create the voice to convey the information correctly. This time, I would like to talk about the case of elderly people in China who have difficulty living and choose prisons as their place to stay. I would like to introduce an article. In Japan, there are cases where elderly people use prisons instead of nursing homes. Also, the title of the article states that this is a warning to China. Is written. There are quite a few similar articles published in Chinese. In another article, you can see the word Japan, but it says that an elderly Japanese man turns himself in and goes to prison. Looking at the contents of this article, we can see that what is taken for granted in Japan is not so common in other countries, but at the same time, it also reveals that there is a serious problem that is not usually seen as a problem in Japanese society. I will understand. I'll give you a specific example. In Japan, there are elderly people who shoplift a small amount of goods in order to go to jail, then turn themselves in and are convicted and go to jail. If you don't have a place to live, you're an elderly person. So even if you want to work somewhere, if you don't have a place to work, you won't be close to yourself. It's introduced because there are people who don't have a place for themselves other than prison. It's a bit off topic, but there is an introduction to Japan from the perspective of a Chinese person. Conversely, I would like to explain the differences in sensibilities and cultures between Japanese and foreigners. Shoplifting is a crime of theft in Japan. If it's the first time, I don't think I'll be sentenced to prison. But if I try again after receiving a suspended sentence, I'll be sentenced to prison. From a Chinese point of view, this is a story that makes me wonder if Japan is so strict. One article says that Japan is particularly strict about theft. The reason for such an evaluation is that Chinese theft crimes are ranked according to the value of the stolen items. The higher the value of the stolen item, the heavier the crime, and on the contrary, if the amount is less than a certain amount, it is not treated as theft. For example, if you shoplift an anpan at a convenience store, in Japan it would not be surprising if you were to be sentenced to prison if you repeatedly shoplifted like that, but in China, it is not a crime of theft in the first place. That part is stricter in Japan. The reason why China treats it more loosely than Japan is that if even a small amount of theft is treated as a crime, there are too many and the criminal justice system will not work. Also, there is an image that punishment is severe in China, but in fact, when the security situation deteriorates and it becomes impossible to secure enough costs to maintain public order in the court system, crimes that occur frequently will occur. As for it, it's no longer a crime. In other words, if there are too many shoplifters, even if the penalties are made stricter, there will be a shortage of personnel on the control side, which will lead to a decrease in the power of the penalties. That is, it reduces the intimidating power of punishment. When there are too many serious crimes, society as a whole will stop policing them. Compared to Japan and China, China is very unsafe, and you can see that shoplifting-level crimes occurred so many times that they could not be cracked down. Even with the one-party dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party, you can see that it is very difficult to maintain social order. The story I just told you is not just about China. Even in the UK, if the damage is less than £50, the police won't act anymore. It seems like there are a lot of people in England who are willing to steal less than £50. It is said that this has reached a level that puts pressure on corporate management. If this situation continues, the company will calculate the loss caused by shoplifting as a cost and add it to the price of the product, so in the end it will be the people who pay properly who will eventually bear the burden. Because it is. It's not just a matter of saying that the company is losing money, but the result is that the people who are seriously paying the money will all bear the burden. It is introduced that there is a similar thing in the United States. Moreover, since America is a gun society, it seems that it has developed into robbery instead of shoplifting. In the United States, depending on the state, if the amount of damage is small, it will be treated as a misdemeanor, so no full-scale investigation will be conducted. As a store owner, you have no choice but to run your own store, but America is a gun society. So it seems that the reality of America is that many people die in gunfights between robbers and store owners. In other words, shoplifting is not a crime, so the store must protect itself. In a gun society like America, It would develop into a very big incident, and although Britain is basically not a gun society, this time the people who pay the money will ultimately bear the cost. Increase. Originally, as in Japan, theft should be treated as theft, even if it is a small amount. In the UK, the US and China, shoplifting-level illegal acts cannot afford to be cracked down even if they are crimes. Back to the main topic, in Japan, if you repeat an illegal act at the level of shoplifting, you will be sentenced to prison. I think that the fact that there are elderly people who shoplift and turn themselves in and end up in prison gives China the impression that the welfare of the elderly in Japan is ruined. Talking about the elderly in Japan is not limited to the elderly. People who only have a place in prison are people who did some crime when they were young and were in prison. There are quite a few people who have come out of prison but have nowhere to stay, so they commit crimes again, or commit crimes without regrets and get caught, and they become elderly people. I think that this is a problem of the person himself rather than the welfare of Japan. There may be people who are having trouble making a living and going to jail. In the case of Japan, there is a public assistance system, so it is highly likely that there is some kind of problem with the person concerned rather than the problem of welfare in Japan. What the Chinese are afraid of is that when they become elderly, they will not be able to live a decent life in the real world, so they are worried that more and more people will turn prisons into nursing homes. Increase. And there have been cases of people committing crimes in order to actually live in prison for quite some time. I would like to introduce an article. It's a land in southern China, but 23 years ago, a certain person was inspired to make a name for himself, but even after 10 years, no buds had sprouted and he was in poverty, so he spent the rest of his life in prison. It is written that I thought about it. However, it is terrible from there, but it is said that he killed 3 people, went to the police station and turned himself in. However, it seems that he was drunk when he turned himself in. He probably killed 3 people with the help of alcohol, but the police dismissed him because he was drunk. And it seems that the police told the criminal that if he turned himself in, he should go somewhere else. It seems that he killed 2 more people in the market or something just outside the police station. As a result, he was caught and sentenced to death. As a Chinese conception, going to prison seems to be quite vicious, or rather, it seems that there is an image that it is a criminal who has committed a serious crime. Let me introduce another example. It's about 2008, but after all, life in the real world is too painful, so a man who thought that life in prison would be better went to Beijing. Perhaps they thought Beijing prisons were better equipped. He went all the way to Beijing and committed a robbery near the train station. Recently there have been violent robberies in Japan, but in any country, robbery is regarded as a very heinous crime and is a serious crime. This man was also sentenced to 2 years in prison and a fine of 6,000 yuan. I don't have the money to pay the fine, but as of 2008, 2 years imprisonment for suddenly attacking a woman outdoors and robbing it, so it's easier than I thought. From the point of view of Chinese society, if a prison sentence of 10 years or so is imposed for something of this magnitude, the prison may become full and stop going around. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, and when he went to prison, he said that life in prison was better, just as this man thought. This guy, he didn't eat meat for 2 years before he went to jail. However, prison meals sometimes contain meat. Plus, he has an egg in it. And he can read books and he has time to watch TV. And there are doctors in prisons, and clothes are provided. He says his standard of living has improved and he has put on more weight than when he was outside. And this person did well in prison. In short, he did his job properly without causing any problems, so he was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but it was shortened to 1.5 years, and then he was admitted to a nursing home prepared by the authorities. However, the old people's home has cracks in the walls and leaks in the rain. And I have to take care of everything around me by myself, and the daily allowance is 10 yuan. And he has to cover all his living expenses with it, so he has almost nothing left after food expenses. This guy, well, he has no money, but he loves cigarettes. Life in the nursing home is worse than life in prison. Depending on which prison you go to, some people in China have a worse life than prison life. For example, if you compare what they eat, I think there are a lot of people who say it's worse than prison. If you are still young and don't want to have your freedom taken away, and if you think that if you do your best now, something good might come your way in the future, you may not want to go to prison. However, there are quite a few people who become elderly and find it difficult to find a place to live because they have no place to work. If that happens, there is a possibility that such people will increase more and more in China. When that happens, it wouldn't be strange for many people to commit illegal acts in order to get into prison if they were told that prison would be better than their current life. And, as I mentioned earlier, there is an image in China that only a certain amount of heinous crime can be sentenced to prison. The murders and robberies I introduced earlier are definitely heinous crimes in Japan. If this is not the case, the number of such crimes will increase, and prisons will be full of elderly people. In the previous example, I introduced a case in which a prisoner came all the way to Beijing to commit a crime, assuming that Beijing would be better treated in prison. Expanding on this idea, it would be better to be caught in Japan than to be caught in China. In Japan, you don't get the death penalty unless you do something extraordinary. In other words, living in a Japanese prison for a long time is much better than living in poverty in China. In Japanese prisons, prisoners are served 3 meals a day and medical care is free. It's becoming a situation where it wouldn't be strange for a large number of people to think about going to Japan aiming for a Japanese prison. I think that it will become more important not only to strictly examine visas, but also to crack down on illegal immigration and border measures in the future. That's all for now. See you next time.